The winter that swallowed the valley was not a season but a sentence. A long, white punishment that pressed its cold fingers into every chimney and keyhole of the town of Everbrook, frosting the windows of bakeries and blacksmith shops alike. Yet no place glowed warmer than the narrow Toymaker's workshop on Alder Street, where Elias Rowan worked from dawn until the lamps were lit, carving soldiers with painted smiles and wooden horses that rocked with stubborn cheer. On the night the dragon girl first appeared, the wind howled like a grieving thing, dragging sheets of snow across the cobblestones, and Elias was just turning the sign on his door from open to closed when he noticed a small shape standing beneath the iron street lamp opposite his window. A thin figure wrapped in a cloak too light for such weather, unmoving despite the storm, her breath not fogging the air as it should have, and though he thought at first she was a child lost from home, something about the way frost crept outward from her boots in delicate spiderweb patterns made him hesitate, for wherever she stood the snow did not melt beneath lamplight but hardened into crystal. She did not knock, did not beg, only watched the golden glow spilling from his shop with eyes that shone faintly blue, like trapped starlight beneath ice, and Elias, who had lived long enough to see strange things in the mountains beyond Everbrook, felt neither fear nor anger, only a heavy, human ache at the sight of someone so small standing alone in a storm. He opened the door, letting a spill of warmth tumble into the street, and called out, "You'll freeze out there." To which the girl tilted her head slightly, as if puzzled by the idea, and replied in a voice soft and distant, "I do not freeze." Her words edged with a faint shimmer that crackled like thin ice underfoot, and when she stepped closer he saw the truth of her nature in the faint, pearlescent scales tracing her temples and the delicate curve of horn tips hidden in her silver-white hair, features subtle but unmistakable, and yet there was nothing monstrous in her expression, only an exhausted stillness. Townsfolk whispered of dragons nesting high in the Frost Peak range, ancient beings of flame and fury, but this child carried winter itself in her bones, and Elias realized she was no threat to his little wooden soldiers or cloth dolls, only a creature displaced from somewhere she could not return. "Then you won't mind the cold," he said, gently. "But I do, and I'd rather not watch you stand there all night." And though she did not smile, she followed him inside, Frost retreating reluctantly from the doorway as if offended by the hearth's glow. The bell above the door chimed, and for a heartbeat the air inside the shop turned sharp and crystalline, tiny flakes forming on the shelves, but Elias closed the door firmly and stirred the fire until sparks leapt bright and defiant, and the girl stood near the entrance, careful not to brush against the hanging paper stars or rows of painted trains, her gaze sweeping over the cluttered wonderland with something like disbelief. "What is this place?" she asked, and Elias replied simply, "It's where I make warmth." Though he knew she meant the toys, the colors, the life carved into simple wood, and when he offered her a stool near the hearth she hesitated as if the fire might wound her, yet she sat, the edges of the stool rhyming faintly with frost before settling. And as the storm raged outside, a strange balance formed in the workshop, heat pushing against cold, ember against snow, man against dragon. Neither conquering the other, only coexisting in a fragile truce. He poured a cup of broth and set it near her hands, though he suspected she did not need food as humans did, and she watched the steam rise with quiet fascination, whispering, "It looks like breath," and Elias nodded, unaware that this small exchange, this shared room against the storm, would become the first crack in the ice that encased not just the valley but the dragon girl's guarded heart. For though she claimed she did not freeze, there was something within her colder than winter, and something within him stubborn enough to try and warm it. Her name, she told him after a long silence, was Lyra, a name that carried a distant echo like wind through frozen caverns, and over the next hours Elias learned that she had not come to Everbrook by accident but by exile, cast down from the Frost Peak range by her own kind for a flaw she described only as burning wrong, which he did not understand until she held her hand toward the fire and instead of shrinking from the heat, the flames bent toward her in confusion, hissing softly as frost threaded through their orange glow. She was meant to be a dragon of ice and storm, yet somewhere within her slept a spark not of winter but of warmth, and her kin, proud and merciless in their ancient codes, had named it corruption, weakness, and driven her away lest she thaw what they guarded. Elias listened without interruption, carving absently at a block of cedar as she spoke, the scent of fresh wood mingling with chimney smoke, and when she finished he turned the carving toward her, revealing the rough shape of a small dragon perched protectively around a lantern. Its wings curved not in menace but shelter, and Lyra stared at it with a wonder that made the air around her shimmer. "You make us small," she said, not offended but amazed, and Elias chuckled softly. "I make everyone small. Makes the world easier to hold," he replied, and in that answer lay the quiet defiance of humanity, the stubborn insistence on shaping vast fears into manageable forms. Outside, the storm worsened, townsfolk hurrying past the windows unaware that an exiled dragon child sat within the toymaker's shop, and yet the cold that clung to Lyra began to recede by degrees, not melted but softened, as if confused by the steady patience of a man who did not see her as a threat or curse but simply as a girl, with nowhere to go. She confessed she had stood outside for hours before he noticed, drawn not by hunger or need but by the warmth radiating from the building, warmth that was more than firelight, something layered in laughter from children who visited during the day and the quiet devotion Elias poured into every carved smile. "I thought if I stood close enough," she admitted, "perhaps it would not hurt so much," and though she did not clarify what hurt, Elias understood it was not the cold she meant but loneliness, that sharp, invisible frost that bites deeper than winter winds. He offered her no grand promises, only a blanket and a place near the hearth, and when she drifted into sleep, the first true rest she had known since exile, the flames burned steady and strong, neither extinguished by her presence nor flaring out of control, and Elias kept watch, carving through the night, shaping not just toys but a fragile sanctuary within 4 wooden walls, unaware that far above in the mountains, ancient eyes of ice had turned toward Everbrook, sensing the flicker of forbidden warmth awakening in one they had cast aside. Morning came pale and brittle, sunlight glinting off snow like shattered glass, and when Lyra awoke she found frost had not claimed the workshop overnight but instead traced delicate, harmless patterns along the windows, as if respecting boundaries drawn not by magic but by kindness, and Elias, exhausted yet content, handed her a small painted soldier with a red coat and said, "Every hero needs a place to stand," though she did not yet understand the weight of those words. News travels quickly in small towns, and whispers soon stirred of strange cold lingering near Alder Street, of breath misting thicker there than elsewhere. Yet no one suspected a dragon child sheltered behind shelves of dolls, for who would imagine such a thing nestled between tin trains and stuffed bears? Lyra helped in small ways, her careful fingers sanding wood with surprising gentleness, her icy touch smoothing splinters without cracking the grain, and in return Elias taught her the language of grain lines and patience, of how warmth is built slowly, layer by layer, not seized in a blaze. Days passed, and the valley's cold deepened unnaturally, as though the mountains themselves resented her absence, storms rolling down with increasing fury, until one evening the sky darkened not with snow but with shadow, vast wings blotting out the fading light as a dragon descended upon Everbrook, scales glittering like forged ice, eyes burning with ancient judgment. Townsfolk screamed and scattered, and Lyra stood frozen not by fear but by recognition, knowing this emissary had come for her, to drag her back or silence the anomaly she represented. Elias stepped outside before she could, placing himself between the monstrous silhouette and his small shop, armed with nothing but a lantern and the unyielding warmth of his hearth blazing behind him. And when the dragon's voice thundered across the square demanding the exile's return, Elias did not tremble but replied, "She is under my roof." Simple words carrying the audacity of humanity itself. Lyra felt the spark within her flare painfully, the forbidden warmth her kin despised igniting not as destruction but as resolve, and when the great dragon exhaled a torrent of killing frost, she moved without thinking, stepping beside Elias and releasing from her chest not ice but flame, bright and gold, clashing against the storm in a blaze that turned snow to steam and filled the square with hissing light. It was not the searing inferno of legend but something fiercer in its own way, a protective fire, fueled not by rage but by choice, and the clash did not shatter buildings nor scorch flesh but carved a boundary in the air itself, a declaration that she would not be dragged back into a world that feared warmth. The ancient dragon recoiled, astonished by this defiance, and in that hesitation lay humanity's triumph, for Elias lifted his lantern higher and said calmly, "Go back to your mountains. We take care of our own." And something in his unwavering stance, in the ordinary courage of a man who carved toys, unsettled the ancient certainty of dragonkind, until with a roar of frustration the emissary retreated into the clouds, leaving Everbrook trembling but intact. In the days that followed, the valley's winter eased as though ashamed of its excess, snow still blanketing rooftops but no longer biting with cruel intent, and Everbrook's people, having glimpsed terror and survived, gathered in cautious curiosity around Alder Street, where they found not ruin but resilience, and Lyra stood beside Elias, no longer hiding her scaled temples or horn tips, her eyes steady rather than distant. Fear lingered, as it always does, but it was tempered by gratitude, for, had she not stood against the greater dragon, Frost might have swallowed them all, and children, braver than their elders, approached first, marveling at the faint shimmer that followed her steps, asking if she could make snowflakes dance, which she did with shy concentration, crafting delicate spirals that melted harmlessly into laughter. Elias continued carving, adding a new figure to his collection, a dragon girl with wings curved protectively around a tiny wooden town, and placed it proudly in the window, not as spectacle but as testament. Lyra discovered that the spark within her was not corruption but balance, that she could call forth frost to cool fevered brows and flame to rekindle dying hearths, and in serving the town she found belonging deeper than blood-bound mountain codes. Word spread beyond the valley of a dragon who burned with warmth rather than wrath, and though distant peaks still watched with wary eyes, none descended again, perhaps wary themselves of the quiet strength housed in a humble workshop. On the anniversary of her arrival, when winter threatened once more to tighten its grip, Lyra stood outside the shop beneath the same iron street lamp where she had once waited alone, and Elias joined her, offering no grand speeches, only his steady presence, and she realized that what he had shared that first night was not merely heat from a hearth but a fragment of humanity's greatest magic, the refusal to abandon another to the cold. She turned toward him, and said, with a smile that no longer seemed fragile, "I used to think I did not freeze." And he chuckled softly, replying, "Everyone freezes sometimes. That's why we keep the fire going." And above them the sky cleared, stars bright and sharp, yet no longer distant, for in the heart of Everbrook a dragon girl and a Toymaker had proven that warmth need not be hoarded to be powerful, that even the smallest hearth can challenge ancient storms, and that sometimes the bravest act in a world of frost is simply to open a door and share the little warmth you have. Spring did not arrive in Everbrook all at once. It crept in cautiously, as though unsure whether the valley would permit such softness after the violence of that winter, and though the snow began to loosen its grip along the riverbanks, the mountains still loomed white and watchful, their silence heavy with unspoken warning. Lyra felt that silence like a distant ache behind her ribs, a reminder that her story with dragonkind was unfinished, and while she helped Elias mend shutters, repaint signs and carve new toys for the children who now visited more boldly than ever, she sensed a gathering beyond sight, a pressure in the air that made frost prickle faintly along her fingertips even when the hearth burned strong. Rumors drifted down from traveling merchants of unrest in the high passes, of ice storms that moved against the wind and shadows crossing the moon in disciplined formation rather than solitary flight, and though Everbrook tried to return to ordinary life, the memory of wings blotting out the sky had carved caution into every heart. One evening, as Lyra stood by the river watching thawed water rush free from its frozen prison, she saw her reflection ripple. Not silver and scaled alone, but wreathed in faint gold fire that pulsed with each breath, and she understood at last that what her kin feared was not weakness but change, that if one dragon could hold both frost and flame without being torn apart, then the ancient certainty of their dominion over winter might fracture like thin ice under spring sun. Elias found her there, carrying a wooden box filled with tiny carved birds meant to hang from the shop ceiling, and he did not ask what troubled her, only said, "Wood splits when it dries too fast. Best to let it change slow." And she almost laughed at the simplicity of the wisdom, for humans had always lived at the mercy of shifting seasons, adapting because they must, while dragons clung to permanence as though it were power. That night the sky trembled with distant thunder not born of storm but of wings, and Lyra did not wait for fear to root her to the floorboards as it once had, instead stepping into the street before the town bells could ring. Her presence calm and resolute, for she knew this was not an executioner come in secret but a delegation bold enough to arrive openly. 3 dragons descended beyond the fields, vast and terrible, their scales reflecting starlight in shards of blue and white, and at their center stood an elder whose horns curved like a crown of spears, eyes ancient with calculation rather than rage. The townsfolk gathered behind Elias's workshop, uncertain but unwilling to abandon the girl who had shielded them. And when the elder spoke, the voice rolled like grinding glaciers, declaring that Lyra's existence threatened the balance of their kind, that flame within an ice-born dragon would sow division and eventual ruin. Lyra stepped forward alone, though Elias's steady presence remained just behind her shoulder, and answered not with defiance but with clarity, explaining that balance was not broken by difference but strengthened by it, that winter without the promise of thaw was nothing but death stretched long. And as she spoke, the gold fire flickered along her scales without melting them, a living testament to harmony rather than corruption. The elder regarded her in heavy silence, then unleashed a surge of pure frost into the sky, not aimed at the town but forming a towering spire of ice between them. A challenge, a test of will and nature, and Lyra understood that words alone would not shift millennia of tradition, so she inhaled deeply and released both elements at once. Frost spiraling with flame in a luminous helix that struck the spire and did not shatter it but transformed it. Ice turning clear and strong as crystal lit from within. A structure neither cold nor hot but radiant, refracting dawn's first light into 1,000 colors across the valley. The dragons recoiled not in pain but in astonishment, for they had never witnessed their sacred element altered without destruction, and in that shimmering tower lay proof that power need not be singular to be sovereign. The elder's gaze lingered on the townsfolk, standing unarmed yet unyielding behind a human Toymaker, and perhaps for the first time in centuries, dragonkind saw humanity not as fleeting creatures of soft flesh but as beings whose strength lay in fragile, persistent warmth, and without another word the delegation rose into the brightening sky, leaving behind uncertainty rather than condemnation, which in the language of ancient beings was the first crack in dogma. Summer came golden and full, wildflowers pushing defiantly through soil once locked in ice, and the crystal spire Lyra had forged remained at the edge of Everbrook as both monument and reminder, catching sunlight by day and moonlight by night, no longer a threat but a beacon visible from the lower mountain paths. And though no dragons descended in hostility again, shapes were sometimes seen circling at great distance, watchful yet restrained. Life within the workshop flourished. Children, laughing louder than before, their drawings now including dragons not as monsters but guardians, and Elias found his hands busier than ever carving figures inspired by the strange new chapter unfolding around them. Yet he noticed too that Lyra's wings, once half-furled and uncertain, stretched wider each day, stronger, as though the acceptance of one small town had given her bones permission to grow. She began traveling short distances into the foothills, not in exile but as emissary, leaving trails of harmless frost that nourished high-altitude flowers and sparks of controlled flame that cleared deadwood to prevent wildfires, acts of balance witnessed cautiously by younger dragons who lingered at ridgelines, curiosity slowly overtaking suspicion. One afternoon, a fledgling dragon no larger than a barn landed beyond the crystal spire, scales shimmering pale as morning mist, and though it did not approach the town, it watched Lyra as she demonstrated shaping frost into intricate patterns without extinguishing the warm breeze that followed, and something unspoken passed between them. Possibility, perhaps, or relief. Change among dragons would not be swift, for ancient creatures measure time differently. Yet seeds once planted cannot be unimagined, and back in Everbrook, as harvest season painted the valley gold, the townspeople held a festival not in fear of winter's return but in gratitude for survival. Lanterns strung from rooftop to rooftop, music rising into clear night air, and at its center stood Lyra and Elias beside a great bonfire whose flames danced high without threatening to consume. When asked to speak, Elias merely gestured to Lyra, who hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping forward. Her voice steady as she told them that warmth is not the absence of cold but the courage to stand within it together, that dragons and humans alike had mistaken isolation for strength when true endurance lay in shared fire. Cheers rose, simple and human, and as sparks lifted toward the stars, Lyra felt no pull of exile, no ache of divided nature, only the steady beat of belonging, and she realized that what began as a man opening his door against a storm had become something larger than either of them. A quiet revolution born not from conquest but compassion. Long after the music faded and lanterns dimmed, she remained by the dwindling bonfire with Elias, watching embers glow red beneath ash. And she understood that even when flames appear small, there. Heat lingers, ready to be stirred back to brilliance, and high above, unseen but not unfelt, distant wings turned not in hostility but in contemplation. For the age of unbroken winter had been challenged not by armies or ancient spells but by a toymaker who shared the only warmth he had and a dragon girl brave enough to accept it. And in that shared courage lay the promise of seasons yet to come, balanced and bright.